The most powerful man in Manhattan had built his empire on the belief that money could erase mistakes before they ever became real. Sebastian Calloway lived inside glass towers and private elevators, surrounded by systems designed to obey him without question. At 42, he was a self-made tech billionaire whose artificial intelligence corporation quietly shaped finance, security, and data infrastructure across the country. His name carried authority, but his presence carried distance. People spoke carefully around him, measured their tone, and rarely met his eyes for long. Sebastian's personality was shaped by control. He calculated outcomes before emotions could interfere and believed vulnerability was a liability disguised as depth. His days were governed by contracts, NDAs, and schedules optimized to the minute. Reputation mattered more than comfort, and legacy mattered more than connection. Recently, he had ended a highly publicized engagement with Manhattan socialite Vivian Sterling, a relationship that had looked flawless to the public, but had been hollow behind closed doors. The breakup was framed as mutual, strategic, and dignified, but in truth it reflected Sebastian's inability to sustain emotional closeness without feeling threatened by it. Inside his Upper East Side townhouse, every surface was curated and silent. That was where Amara Whitfield existed, almost invisibly. At 27, she worked as a housekeeper, hired through a discreet agency that specialized in high-profile clients. She was intelligent, observant, and financially strained, supporting her younger brother's college tuition after their mother's passing. Amara moved through the house with quiet precision, noticing details others ignored. She learned Sebastian's moods by the way he removed his jacket, the pressure with which he set down his phone, the silence that followed difficult calls. She rarely spoke unless spoken to, not because she lacked confidence, but because she understood the cost of visibility in spaces ruled by power. Their interaction was defined by imbalance and isolation. Sebastian barely registered her as a person at first, only as a constant presence that made the house function. Yet over time, he began to rely on her steadiness. During late nights filled with corporate crises and legal battles, her quiet efficiency became a strange form of comfort. She was there when the house felt too empty, when success felt heavy rather than triumphant. The tension between them grew subtly, unspoken and unacknowledged. Sebastian was under immense pressure as his company prepared for a landmark merger that would cement his influence permanently. The stress cracked something he had kept sealed for decades. One night, exhaustion blurred his judgment, and loneliness overcame restraint. The moment that followed was not born of romance or intention, but of weakness. It was brief, private, and immediately buried beneath layers of denial. Weeks later, Amara's world shifted irrevocably. She discovered she was pregnant and sat alone with the knowledge, weighing every possible consequence. Telling Sebastian meant risking her dignity, her livelihood, and her peace. Not telling him meant carrying the burden alone. She chose dignity over desperation, deciding that silence was safer than being reduced to an inconvenience. She continued working, careful, composed, hiding the truth behind professionalism. Sebastian learned of the pregnancy not through her voice, but through a mistake. A private medical bill, routed incorrectly through an account linked to his corporate insurance provider, landed on his desk. The name caught his attention immediately. His reaction was sharp and defensive. Suspicion replaced reflection. He questioned her motives before questioning himself. Lawyers were contacted within hours, and legal silence was ordered before empathy had any chance to surface. He demanded a DNA test, not as a path to truth, but as a barrier against responsibility. To protect himself from scandal, Sebastian terminated Amara's employment quietly, framing it as a restructuring decision. That no explanation was offered beyond a severance package designed to close the situation permanently. Amara accepted the dismissal without protest. She did not argue, cry, or beg. She packed her things with the same calm she had always carried and left the house without looking back. The silence she maintained was not weakness, but loyalty to herself. Sebastian watched the situation retreat into distance and convinced himself it was resolved. The problem had been contained, the risk managed. In his mind, money and authority had once again done their job. But what he failed to understand was that some consequences do not announce themselves immediately. They grow quietly, beyond contracts and control, waiting for the moment when denial is no longer enough. He believed the chapter was closed, unaware that the life he had dismissed was already rewriting his future. She carried more than a child. Amara Whitfield carried the quiet weight of being dismissed as if her existence had never truly mattered. After leaving Sebastian Calloway's townhouse, she relocated to a modest one-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn, a space that echoed with unfamiliar stillness. The neighborhood was honest and unpolished, far from the controlled elegance she had once moved through silently. Every creaking stair and distant siren reminded her that life had shifted into something raw and unprotected. Financial pressure followed quickly. Severance money thinned faster than expected, and medical expenses loomed constantly in her thoughts. Amara hid her pregnancy from most people, not out of shame, but out of instinct. She understood how quickly sympathy could turn into judgment. To survive, she took a part-time remote bookkeeping job that paid just enough to keep the lights on. The work was tedious, but it gave her something precious: autonomy. Each completed task felt like proof that she could still stand on her own. Isolation became her constant companion. Nights were long, filled with quiet reflections and unspoken fears. Yet within that silence lived resilience. Amara began structuring her days carefully, eating well, walking often, and reading late into the night. Her determination to protect her unborn son became her anchor. Every decision she made passed through one question only: would this keep him safe? That purpose steadied her when uncertainty threatened to overwhelm her. While her world narrowed, Sebastian's expanded effortlessly. He resumed his elite lifestyle without visible interruption. Public appearances returned to his calendar, and headlines praised his latest corporate acquisitions. Industry insiders whispered about potential political ambitions, framing him as a future leader capable of bridging technology and governance. His life continued to move forward at an accelerated pace, untouched by the consequences he believed he had already managed. Behind closed doors, however, pressure mounted from another direction. His mother, Eleanor Calloway, remained deeply invested in the idea of legacy. Conversations about heirs surfaced frequently, disguised as casual remarks but weighted with expectation. These discussions unsettled him more than he admitted. They stirred a discomfort he refused to examine closely. Instead of confronting it, he buried himself in work and avoided thinking about Amara altogether. The DNA test results he had demanded were delayed due to a laboratory backlog. Days turned into weeks, then months. In that absence of confirmation, Sebastian chose the assumption that served him best. He convinced himself the child was not his. Outwardly, he remained composed and indifferent. Internally, a faint doubt surfaced at inconvenient moments, only to be dismissed with logic and pride. He told himself that if the truth mattered, it would have arrived already. Amara never requested financial support. Pride and self-respect guided her silence. Instead, she began documenting everything privately. She kept records, dates, and medical notes, not as leverage, but as protection. She also started writing letters to her unborn child. In those pages, she poured the thoughts she shared with no one else. She wrote about fear, about uncertainty, and about hope shaped carefully from hardship. Each letter strengthened her resolve to raise her child with honesty and dignity. As her pregnancy progressed, exhaustion blended with quiet endurance. There were moments of fear about raising a child alone, moments when the weight felt nearly unbearable. Yet her strength was rooted deeply in her refusal to be diminished. She reminded herself daily that silence could be powerful, that survival did not require permission. The absence of acknowledgement from Sebastian became a scar she learned to live with rather than reopen. When the time came, Amara gave birth to a healthy baby boy. She named him Micah Whitfield, choosing her own last name without hesitation. In that moment, she claimed full responsibility for the life she had brought into the world. On the birth certificate, The space for the father remained blank. It was not an act of spite, but a declaration of independence. Micah belonged to her, and she would not tie his identity to uncertainty. Months later, in a glass, walled office overlooking Manhattan, an envelope finally landed on Sebastian Calloway's desk. The DNA results he had forgotten arrived quietly, long after he convinced himself they no longer mattered. The envelope waited on Sebastian Calloway's desk, thin and ordinary, yet heavy enough to still the room around him. He opened it without ceremony, expecting closure, prepared to dismiss it as another solved inconvenience. Instead, the number stared back at him with surgical precision, stripping away comfort and certainty in a single instant. 99.99%. The illusion of control collapsed quietly, leaving disbelief in its place. Disbelief gave way to panic almost immediately. His first instinct was not reflection but calculation, the familiar reflex of a man trained to manage risk. Reputation flashed before him like a warning signal, followed by headlines he could already imagine. He summoned his legal team and ordered a full investigation into Amara Whitfield's life, seeking reassurance that the situation could still be contained. The reports returned quickly and unsettled him more than any accusation could have. Amara had never sued, never contacted the media, never requested financial support. There were no interviews, no threats, no attempts to leverage his name. Her silence was complete and deliberate. That restraint disturbed him deeply, because it could not be explained by greed or strategy. Against advice, Sebastian drove to Brooklyn alone, choosing anonymity over distance. He parked several blocks away and walked through streets that felt unfamiliar and exposed. The building was modest, worn by time rather than neglect. From across the street, he saw her through a window, moving carefully through a small room, holding a child with instinctive tenderness. Something fractured inside him as he watched. The child's features unsettled him, not because they were unfamiliar, but because they were not. The eyes carried a reflection he recognized, and when the child shifted, a small birthmark appeared on his shoulder, identical to one Sebastian had carried since birth. Denial weakened, replaced by an ache he could not name. Back in his office, the debate began. Public acknowledgement threatened scandal, while private settlement promised quiet resolution. His lawyers advised a financial approach, a trust fund substantial enough to secure compliance and distance. Sebastian accepted the logic and reached out formally, framing responsibility as a transaction rather than a relationship. Amara listened without interruption when the proposal was delivered. She rejected legal intimidation calmly, refusing to trade her child's presence for security. She agreed only to discuss co-parenting, insisting on balance and respect rather than surrender. In that moment, the power dynamic shifted, leaving Sebastian facing a boundary money could not cross. The refusal unsettled him far more than anger would have. For the first time, his usual tools failed to move the situation in his favor. Contracts felt thin, influence felt hollow, and certainty slipped further away. He realized that Amara's strength came from a place untouched by his world, a place built on self-respect and resolve rather than leverage. That night, sleep evaded him. He replayed the image of the child in the small apartment, the quiet focus in Amara's movements, the absence of resentment in her response. He understood then that acknowledgement would not grant him control, and silence would not erase responsibility. The truth had already claimed its space. In the days that followed, negotiations replaced assumptions. Every discussion revealed limits he had never encountered before. Amara's terms were simple and unyielding, centered on stability rather than compensation. Sebastian began to grasp that he was no longer dictating outcomes, but responding to them. The certainty that had defined his life continued to erode. He recognized that wealth could offer comfort, but not compliance, influence, but not devotion. Amara's refusal was not rebellion, it was loyalty to her child and to herself. That realization forced him to confront a truth he had long avoided. Control had always been his shield, and now it felt dangerously thin. Each step forward demanded humility instead of authority. He was no longer choosing between options, But between growth and retreat, the child's existence had altered the rules entirely. As realization settled, Sebastian understood the stakes had shifted beyond reputation or wealth. He was negotiating not with opposition, but with principle. For the first time in his life, money failed to open a door and power failed to bend the outcome. The awareness left him exposed and unsettled, standing at the edge of something unfamiliar. He had mastered markets and systems, but this demanded restraint, patience, and accountability. In that tension, he recognized a reality he could neither purchase nor command. The conversation with Amara lingered in his thoughts, reshaping how he viewed authority and obligation. That, for the first time, he sensed that the path ahead would require listening rather than leading, and humility rather than dominance. That realization marked the beginning of a negotiation he could not win with wealth alone. It would test everything he believed about power forever and control. The child who was once an inconvenience became the only person who looked at Sebastian Calloway without fear. That realization arrived quietly, without ceremony, during the early weeks of court-mandated shared custody. The arrangement was precise and uncompromising, built on strict legal parameters that left no room for improvisation. Schedules were documented, transitions monitored, and discretion emphasized. The public remained unaware, protected by layers of confidentiality designed to preserve Sebastian's image and Amara's peace. Fatherhood did not come naturally to Sebastian. Accustomed to commanding rooms and negotiating outcomes, he found himself uncertain and restrained in the presence of an infant. He did not know how to hold Micah without feeling awkward, unsure where to place his hands or how to respond when the child cried. Each interaction felt like a test he had not studied for, exposing vulnerabilities he had spent a lifetime concealing. Micah, however, responded instinctively. The child's reactions were unfiltered, free of judgment or expectation. Over time, small moments began to soften Sebastian's hesitation. The way Micah calmed when held close, the quiet focus in his eyes, and the faint smile that appeared during simple routines chipped away at Sebastian's detachment. The bond formed slowly, not through intention, but through presence. Amara observed everything carefully. She set firm boundaries from the beginning, making it clear that co-parenting required respect, not authority. She refused emotional dependence and rejected any attempt to rewrite the past. Her expectations were practical and unwavering, centered on consistency and accountability rather than reconciliation. Sebastian found those boundaries difficult but necessary, forcing him to adapt rather than dominate. The fragile balance faced its first major challenge when Eleanor Calloway learned of her grandson's existence. The discovery was not gentle. Family tension escalated immediately, shaped by Eleanor's initial disapproval and concern for reputation. She questioned Amara's motives, the secrecy, and the potential impact on the family name. Sebastian found himself in an unfamiliar position, defending a truth he had once tried to avoid. While private conflicts intensified, external pressure followed closely behind. Media speculation began to surface as anonymous sources hinted at inconsistencies in Sebastian's personal life. Rumors of a hidden child circulated cautiously at first, then with increasing boldness. The silence that had protected them started to feel fragile, vulnerable to exposure at any moment. Sebastian stood at a crossroads he could not ignore. Protecting his image meant denying visibility, maintaining distance, and reinforcing secrecy. Protecting his son required presence, acknowledgement, and risk. The choice was no longer abstract. It demanded action that could not be undone. As custody exchanges continued, Sebastian's priorities shifted in subtle but undeniable ways. Meetings were rescheduled, calls unanswered, and public commitments deprioritized. He began to recognize how easily power had once insulated him from consequence, and how fragile that insulation truly was. Micah's needs redefined his understanding of responsibility, reshaping what success meant in ways no boardroom victory ever had. Amara noticed the change, cautious but attentive. She did not mistake effort for transformation, yet she acknowledged consistency when she saw it. Trust did not grow quickly, but it grew honestly, They're rooted in routine rather than promises. Their co-parenting relationship evolved into something functional, if still strained, guided by mutual loyalty to the child they shared. The tension reached a breaking point when a single image surfaced. A paparazzi photograph captured Sebastian holding Micah outside a pediatric clinic, the child resting calmly against him. The image spread quietly at first, then rapidly, threatening to unravel the carefully maintained secrecy. The moment froze Sebastian in place, forcing him to confront the reality he could no longer manage from the shadows. The choice he had delayed now demanded an answer, and the consequences would reshape everything that followed. The internet does not forgive secrets, especially when race and power collide. What began as a single image quickly ignited into a narrative too volatile to control. Headlines hardened within hours, framing the story with sharp certainty and little restraint. Billionaire secret child scandal spread across platforms, repeated endlessly until speculation sounded like fact. The story moved faster than truth ever could. Media outlets framed Amara Whitfield as an opportunist before understanding her silence. Commentary questioned her motives, her character, and her past, reducing her dignity to a storyline built for outrage. Social media amplified every assumption, turning strangers into judges. The collision of wealth, race, and secrecy fed an appetite for conflict that no clarification could satisfy. The market reacted without patience. Stock prices fluctuated sharply as investors measured risk through perception rather than performance. Analysts debated Sebastian Calloway's judgment, questioning whether personal secrecy reflected professional instability. Inside boardrooms, confidence wavered. Leadership, once unquestioned, became conditional. Amara bore the heaviest weight of public exposure. Harassment followed her online presence, invading spaces she had kept private for years. Messages accused, threatened, and diminished her, yet she refused interviews and declined offers to tell her side for profit or protection. Silence remained her shield. She focused on Micah, the preserving routine where chaos threatened to intrude. Sebastian watched from a distance, unable to intervene without escalating attention. Observing Amara endure scrutiny without retaliation unsettled him deeply. The restraint he once misread Ignis revealed itself as strength, her loyalty to her child and to herself held firm under pressure he had never known. Corporate leadership responded swiftly. Advisors urged Sebastian to deny full involvement, to frame responsibility ambiguously, and to protect the brand above all else. The suggestion was clear that distance could stabilize markets. For the first time, he refused. The choice was not impulsive, but deliberate, shaped by months of slow transformation. Sebastian issued his first public acknowledgement without spectacle. He confirmed he was Micah's father and accepted responsibility without deflection. There was no apology tour, no attempt to soften perception. He did not speak of mistakes as lessons, nor did he frame himself as a victim of circumstance. Accountability replaced pride, and humility replaced control. The response was immediate and divided. Some criticized the timing, others questioned sincerity. Yet the statement altered the narrative's trajectory. By claiming responsibility, Sebastian surrendered the illusion of perfection he had once protected at all costs. The image of invincibility fractured, revealing a man choosing consequence over concealment. Within his family, consequences followed closely. Eleanor Calloway requested a private meeting with Amara, driven by concern rather than curiosity. The encounter dismantled assumptions quickly. Eleanor encountered a woman of intelligence, composure, and clarity, someone who had chosen dignity when chaos would have been easier. The meeting reshaped Eleanor's perspective, replacing skepticism with measured respect. As the public debate raged, private alignments shifted. Sebastian recognized how little image mattered when measured against integrity. Each passing day stripped away old defenses, forcing him to confront the reality he had delayed. The scandal did not destroy him, but it dismantled the version of himself built on avoidance. Public scrutiny persisted, yet the tone evolved. Accountability slowed the outrage, introducing complexity where certainty had ruled. Still, the pressure did not ease completely. Every appearance, Every decision carried new weight. Sebastian accepted the burden without resistance, understanding that control had been traded for responsibility. Amara remained steady, refusing to let public opinion dictate her life. Her silence continued to speak louder than commentary ever could. Loyalty to Micah guided her choices, anchoring her through uncertainty. Just as the narrative began to stabilize, a new development emerged quietly, unnoticed by the public but impossible to ignore. A deeper medical report regarding Micah surfaced, carrying implications that reached beyond reputation and image, signaling that the story was far from over. Money could build empires, but it could not guarantee a child's health. That truth settled heavily over the hospital room as Sebastian Calloway stood beside Amara Whitfield, listening to words that reshaped everything he thought he understood. Micah had been diagnosed with a rare genetic immune disorder, one so uncommon that treatment options were limited and uncertain. Without aggressive intervention, his long-term survival could not be promised. The diagnosis dismantled the remaining walls Sebastian had built around himself. For years, he had believed resources could solve any problem, that speed and capital could outrun consequence. Now, neither influence nor wealth could offer certainty. The fragility of Micah's condition stripped success of its meaning, reducing priorities to a single focused time. Sebastian redirected his attention without hesitation. Corporate dominance, once his defining pursuit, receded into the background. He moved resources toward medical research, funding experimental trials, and accelerating access to specialists. Yet even as his influence opened doors, he learned restraint. Decisions were made collaboratively, guided by doctors rather than ambition. Control yielded to care. Amara and Sebastian were forced into constant proximity as Mika's treatment began. Hospital nights stretched long and quiet, filled with monitored breaths and subdued lighting. They shared space without performance, bound by exhaustion and concern rather than conflict. The tension that once defined their interactions softened, replaced by a fragile partnership shaped by necessity. In those hours, emotional walls began to crumble. Sebastian confronted reflections he had avoided for decades. Memories of his absentee father surfaced, revealing patterns of distance he had unknowingly inherited. He recognized his emotional detachment not as strength, but as armor forged from fear. Vulnerability, once dismissed, now felt unavoidable. Amara observed these shifts carefully. She did not rush trust or rewrite history, but she acknowledged presence when it was consistent. Sebastian's loyalty to Micah manifested not in gestures, but in patience, in learning routines, in remaining through uncertainty rather than retreating from it. That constancy mattered more than apologies ever could. Micah responded to treatment with cautious optimism. Small improvements signaled possibility, offering relief tempered by vigilance. Each positive indicator felt earned, a result of persistence rather than promise. The progress reshaped daily rhythms, replacing dread with guarded hope. The media took notice of the change in Sebastian as well. Coverage shifted from scandal to observation, noting his absence from public events and his visible commitment to his son's care. Public opinion softened, not because of explanation, but because behavior spoke where words had failed. The image of a distant billionaire gave way to that of a father navigating uncertainty. As days turned into weeks, Sebastian's understanding of legacy transformed. He no longer measured success by expansion or dominance, but by presence and responsibility. The hospital became a place of reckoning, stripping ambition to its core and revealing what endured without recognition. Just as stability seemed possible, doctors introduced a new layer of complexity. Further analysis suggested Micah's condition may have originated from Sebastian's genetic line, linking the diagnosis to a hidden family history. The revelation carried implications beyond medicine, threatening to reopen questions of responsibility and inheritance. The room fell quiet as the weight of that truth settled. The past, long buried, reached forward again, demanding acknowledgement. The story had not reached resolution, only a deeper turning point, one that would test accountability in ways neither of them had yet faced. The legacy Sebastian Calloway had always feared losing was never money. It was accountability. That realization arrived slowly, shaped by medical records, quiet conversations, and the unraveling of a family history built on a mission. As Micah's condition stabilized under careful treatment, doctors encouraged deeper genetic tracing. What surfaced altered Sebastian's understanding of inheritance more profoundly than any estate plan ever could. He confronted his family's medical history directly, requesting records long sealed by discretion and pride. What he discovered unsettled him. His grandfather had lived with symptoms strikingly similar to Micah's condition, quietly managed and deliberately concealed. The silence had been intentional, a choice to protect reputation over transparency. That decision echoed across generations, shaping behavior, distance, and emotional restraint. The pattern was unmistakable. Men in his family avoided vulnerability, concealed weakness, and equated silence with strength. Sebastian recognized himself within that lineage, understanding how easily he had repeated the same instincts. The difference now was awareness. Where silence once felt protective, it now felt dangerous. Rather than retreat, Sebastian acted publicly. He announced the creation of a foundation dedicated to genetic research and early diagnosis, funding initiatives that encourage transparency instead of concealment. The decision was not framed as charity, but as responsibility. His company followed suit, shifting focus toward healthcare, AI, integrating ethical accountability into innovation. For the first time, ambition aligned with purpose rather than ego. As these changes unfolded, his relationship with Amara evolved quietly. What once existed as tension matured into mutual respect. They developed an emotional partnership without dependency, shaped by shared responsibility rather than obligation. Trust grew not through promises, but through consistency, each decision reinforcing stability for Micah. Eleanor Calloway's transformation followed its own course. Confronted with the truth of her family's history and Micah's resilience, she accepted her grandson fully. The rigidity that once defined her softened, replaced by presence. Family gatherings became intentional rather than performative, marking the beginning of reconstruction rather than reconciliation. Micah's health continued to stabilize. Childhood milestones arrived gently, each one a quiet victory. First steps, first words, moments that carried weight beyond celebration. They represented survival earned through honesty rather than secrecy. Sebastian experienced these milestones with humility, aware of how close he had come to missing them entirely. With time, clarity settled. Sebastian realized that power without compassion was emptiness, and control was an illusion sustained only by avoidance. True strength required acknowledgement, presence, and the courage to remain when retreat felt easier. The lessons reshaped how he approached leadership, family, and himself. Years passed, marked by steadier rhythms and fewer shadows. Yet the past never fully released its grip. One evening, as Micah grew old enough to ask questions shaped by awareness rather than innocence, a moment arrived that reopened old truths. Micah asked why his father had once tried to walk away, a question simple in form but heavy in meaning. The silence that followed carried history, responsibility, and the promise of honesty. The answer would define not only who Sebastian had been, but who he chose to be next. A child's simple question forced Sebastian Calloway to confront the truth he had once buried beneath ambition and denial. Micah's voice was calm, curious rather than accusatory, yet it carried a weight that no boardroom confrontation ever had. The question lingered, stripping away defenses Sebastian no longer wanted to maintain. In that moment, power offered no refuge. Only honesty could answer it. Sebastian reflected on the arrogance that had once defined him, recognizing how easily he had mistaken control for strength. He admitted the shame he had carried silently, not as self-punishment, but as acknowledgement. For years, he had avoided responsibility because it threatened the identity he had constructed so carefully. Speaking now required surrendering the last illusion of invulnerability. He chose honesty without justification. He explained his absence not with excuses, but with ownership, describing fear rather than circumstance. He spoke of immaturity disguised as confidence, of pride that resisted accountability, and of growth earned through consequence. The truth was delivered steadily, without drama, shaped by humility rather than regret. Micah listened with focus beyond his years. By then, he had grown into a brilliant and empathetic teenager, shaped by two parents who valued integrity differently, but equally. His intelligence reflected curiosity, while his empathy reflected awareness. He had learned resilience from Amara and accountability from Sebastian, blending both into a quiet confidence. Amara maintained her independence throughout the years, never surrendering her sense of self to partnership. Co-parenting evolved naturally into collaboration, guided by respect rather than necessity. Their connection deepened without obligation, allowing space for trust without pressure. Romantic reconciliation remained unspoken, present in tone rather than definition, honoring choice over expectation. Public perception of Sebastian shifted gradually. He was no longer seen as flawless or untouchable, but as transformed. His transparency reshaped leadership narratives, replacing dominance with responsibility. The change did not erase his past, but it contextualized it, offering proof that accountability could coexist with authority. The emotional themes that once defined struggle softened into resolution. A dignity in suffering gave way to delayed redemption, earned through consistency rather than performance. Peace arrived not as relief, but as balance, shaped by acceptance rather than control. The final scene unfolded quietly. Sebastian stood among other parents at a school science fair, watching Micah present a project grounded in curiosity and compassion. Pride surfaced without possession, grounded in observation rather than expectation. In that moment, Sebastian understood legacy clearly. It was not capital accumulated or influence preserved, but character demonstrated through choice. He remembered how he had once believed DNA was proof of obligation, a technicality to be managed. Now he understood it differently. It was proof of responsibility, a connection demanding presence rather than avoidance. The test that once threatened to destroy him had instead rebuilt him, reshaping his understanding of love, legacy, and worth. As applause filled the room, Sebastian remained still, aware that redemption was not a destination but a commitment renewed daily. He had not bought love, he had earned peace.